Hey everybody, it's Blake, and today I'm going to be talking about how to answer a K Aff. Now, a lot of people would consider this kind of discussion to be pretty close to the peak of complexity when it comes to progressive arguments. For that reason, I would recommend that before venturing deeper into this video, that you either make yourself comfortable with or watch the videos on the negative critique, the intro to T in theory, answering the negative critique, and intro to K Affs uh, as a kind of minimum database for information going into this discussion today. Um, but once you are comfortable with the concepts covered in those kind of areas, then this stuff should make good sense. Um, and yeah, before we jump into the actual answering of a KF, I'm going to show a slide that should be very familiar if you've watched those other videos that I just talked about. Um, and this is really important concept when it comes to K Affs. I talk about it in the K Aff video quite a bit. I won't waste your time going through the whole spiel about fiat again, but I will just say, remember, pre-fiat is before the implementation of the AF, post-fiat is after the implementation of the AF, and most K affirmatives garner offense off of both pre-fiat and post-fiat things. So when we are structuring our response, we need to make sure that we are responding to both of those types of offense. So when you are answering a KF, you should always be asking yourself, am I shutting both doors? Am I preventing pre-fiat offense and preventing post-fiat offense? Because either one hypothetically can win the KF the round. So we should constantly be having that question in the back of our heads. So now let's jump into the actual responding to a KF part of the discussion, and that is going to be split into two parts. The first being picking off case positions, and then we'll talk about line by lining the AF a little bit later. So when picking off case positions, you can go the T theory route. So remember, KAFs are kind of split into two kind of schools: the topical AFs that affirm the resolution, the non-topical AFs that refuse to affirm the resolution. And so if it's a non-topical AF, I would say you pretty much should read T. There's not really a scenario I can think about where T would not be strategic um, at all against a non-topical KF. It's basically very useful because it puts a side constraint on the pre-fiat offense of the KAF. Because if you're proving that the KAF is providing a model of debate that is per se uneducational, then it doesn't matter how good the discourse of the AF is, because nobody's going to learn from it. Now, when it comes to topical AFs, the question of how offensive theory will be is a little bit more complex, but I still generally recommend going for some type of tier theory offense against any KAF, just because it gives you the opportunity to uplayer on the AF and have a flow that needs to be evaluated prior to the KAF sheet proper. Now, a little bit of advice for how to structure your tier theory argument when you're responding to a KAF. Interps, just like always, should be specific, and especially important when we're answering KAFs, we should avoid negative wording. So instead of saying that the AF cannot do this, we should say that the AF must or may only do this. So instead of saying putting a restriction on the AF, we are putting a like requirement on the AF, which seems like a kind of uh, vague difference, but it does matter ultimately when you're contextualizing this to a KF debate. It's different to say that you can't talk about structural oppression versus saying you must talk about the implementation of a policy action. So, like, one excludes the existence of the AF, and the other says that the AF content can still be valuable, but the formatting needs to be different. So an example of an interp that is both specific and positively worded would be on the 2023 September-October NSDA topic, the affirmative debater may only garner offense off of the hypothetical implementation of a policy guaranteeing the right to housing in the United States. So that is very specific. It is positively worded. It says that the AF may only do something. It's not saying that the AF cannot garner pre-fiat offense or anything like that. It's saying that it may only garner post-fiat offense, which again seems like a minor distinction, but it matters when it comes to K debates. When it comes to standards, you want to focus on generating the best discursive norms for finding solutions. So your standards should be focused on taking out pre-fiat offense of the KAF. So things like clash are really persuasive when it comes to K Affs, responding to K Affs, because if we don't have a clash, we can't produce positive, like iterative advocacy building. So it just becomes a monologue instead of a dialogue, and that's less effective for finding solutions. So stuff like clash is really persuasive when it comes to shaping discursive norms on your standard level of your T theory debate. Another thing that is very strategic is to include independent voters in your standards. These are basically like things like accessibility that make it so that the judge can vote in favor of the negative, vote against the K Aff, based on like a single argument instead of having to win the whole theory shell proper. So make sure that you're articulating as an independent voting issue things like accessibility, and also contextualize those things to the discursive value of the Aff as well. Things that are read in the standard section against K Aff specifically that are very persuasive are TVAs and switch sides debate. So TVAs, which is an abbreviation for topical version of the Aff, is basically saying that there is a version of the affirmative's argument that is still that meets the interp but still upholds the core thesis of what the Aff is saying. So this is basically the proof that reading theory does not preclude the Aff from existing, but rather argues that the structure of the Aff should be different. And when we're going up against a non-topical Aff, that TVA goes a long way in proving that the resolution is not always violent, because we can prove that there is a version of the Aff that affirms the resolution and still maintains the thesis that it's trying to prove. Switch sides debate basically says that the advocacy concern is resolved because you can just read the non-topical Aff as a negative K. And that switch sides debate, where you're just reading the same thing on both sides, is less educational than if you are just reading the negative argument on the negative side and coming up with like a topical version of the thesis for the affirmative side. Then when it comes to voters, generally speaking, I think most judges would find education to be more persuasive than fairness when it comes to K Affs, because education is a side constraint to the pre-fiat implications of the Aff. Basically, if the Aff is a bad educational model, it doesn't matter how good its discourse is because nobody learns from it. And fairness is okay as a voter, but it should be implicated to the pre-fiat impact of the Aff. So talk about things like recruitment and the existence of the activity. Like if debate has positive discursive value per the Aff, like the Aff is arguing that there's pre-fiat benefits to be gained from reading this in a place like debate, but it makes debate unfair, so nobody will join. Recruitment goes down. Nobody's learning from the discursive value of debate. So you're effectively destroying the platform that you're saying is good. So implicate fairness to the pre-fiat impact of the Aff. And also on T, you can read jurisdiction as a voter. Basically, the judge only has the ability to sign aff or neg, meaning affirmation of the resolution or negation of the resolution. Not, I think that, the non-topical KF is a good idea. That's not an option for you to circle on the ballot. So you can only vote affirm the resolution or negate the resolution. And so that's an independent voter. So now let's talk a little bit about K strategies. So neg Ks that you can read against K Affs. I kind of split them into two schools, but the line between the two schools is a little blurred. So take this with a grain of salt. I just think that this way of explaining it is helpful for some people. So I wanted to include it in the video. And so that is, you can kind of go the methods debate route, or you can go the all-in pre-fiat K route. And so the methods debate route is basically saying that I agree with the problem that the Aff has isolated, but there is a better method through which we can solve it. So for instance, if there is a topical fem K Aff that says that, affirming is good for feminist progress making, then a negative K that is topical, that is a topical K that you already had prepped that says the resolution actually expands the patriarchy or something like that, is going to be very persuasive in saying the method of the Aff, that is the implementation of the resolution for a topical Aff, is bad because it expands the patriarchy, and here is an alt proposing a different method through which we can solve the same problem. There's also a lot of picks that serve as method stuff, so like language pick, like read the advocacy text of the Aff in a different language, a language other than English, for purposes, a lot of times that impacts to things like disrupting the colonial nature of English. Um, or the redacted pick is becoming pretty popular, where you basically say that you affirm redacted, or uh, you defend redacted, instead of saying the plan text. So the plan text of the AF is fitted into the redacted section of the pick alt, and the reason for doing that is to hide it from things like the university and the state, if the university and state are proven bad by the thesis of the K. The pre-fiat Ks are basically saying that there is a feature of the AF that makes it fail. So there is something pre-fiat, like structurally, like when designing or reading or expanding the discourse of the AF, that leads to the method not working. And so that is things like the university K, which says that the university system or academia that debate exists within will kind of co-opt any movements that are started within it. And so you'll hear a lot of like references to like occupied UC Berkeley and stuff like that as part of the university K. That stuff's pretty standard. The ballot K, which says that your method may be entirely good, but saying that the ballot for debate will validate the movement is a bad thing, and calling for the ballot is a bad thing. So instead, we should reject the affirmative's call for the ballot. There's word picks, which says, like, the AF uses a term that is considered problematic. Like, for instance, on the current debate topic, there's a lot of discussion about the use of the term Middle East as a colonialist term. And so the word pick might say that we advocate for the entirety of the AF except for their use of the term Middle East, because that is a problematic term. And so basically, like, the thesis of the AF is valid, but the structure of the AF and its use of this particular terminology is such that we should reject it. And there's also the cap K. This is kind of like the stereotypical response to a K Aff is a cap K, which basically says, like, within capitalism, any like form of performance or resistance gets like cannibalized by the capitalistic state. You will find lots and lots and lots of sample cap Ks out there against K Affs if you just do a little bit of searching on open evidence or the wiki or anything like that. Now, the note I have here at the bottom is that when it comes to our Ks against K Affs, we want to consider the way that the role of the ballot debate plays into this. So I always recommend reading a K that has a counter role of the ballot to the role of the ballot within the K Aff. However, if you are very particular in how you are wording your extension of the K and your explanation of the K, you can also just weigh to the role of the ballot the app provides, especially if the role of the ballot has something to do with providing the best method to do XYZ, because if you prove that their method is bad and that the alt method is preferable, that's a reason that you're winning under their framework. But generally speaking, KVK debates are where you get role of the ballot v role of the ballot debates, and those are handled just like framing debates of any kind, really, with a little bit more of a meta tilt. So what about disads and counterplans? So disads and counterplans are a completely valid strategy to go for against topical K Affs. If the AF does not affirm the topic, reading a topical disad or a topical counterplan is in essence a waste of time. So you want to make sure that the AF is actually affirming the implementation of the resolution before you get up and read a disad or counterplan. But there are persuasive ways to do that, to read a disad and counterplan against a K Aff. So counterplan text should be informed by the advocacy of the AF. So if the AF, like, advocacy rejects the use of the state, then the counterplan probably should use the same actor as the AF, unless it's specifically an actor counterplan that argues that the use of the state is essential. So basically just take notes from the AF advocacy, because if the counterplan is like totally misses the boat, that the AF criticizes the state and the counterplan just gets up and says, do this other thing through the state, but doesn't argue that the state is good, then that was, again, in essence, a waste of time. Remember that our disads and our counterplans engage on the post-fiat levels, so they should be read in conjunction with something pre-fiat. I hesitate to say that I have ever seen somebody successfully take out a K Aff with just disads. Counterplans sometimes, if they're like really effective picks that get in on the pre-fiat level, but anything that's like exclusively post-fiat, like most disads, topical disads, should be read in conjunction with something like K or T theory or a pick. But in engaging on the post-fiat level, you should say something along the lines of, if I can prove that the advocacy of the aff makes the lived experience of X group worse, then you have to negate. So if the aff is like, trying to solve for ableism, if I can prove that the advocacy of the aff makes the lived experience of people with disabilities worse, then you have to negate. And there are instances where the X group will be everybody, right? If it's like a securitization or a capitalism aff or militarism or anything like that. But in essence, you're trying to prove that the aff is bad post-fiat, and you just say a line like this to prove that if you win the post-fiat debate, you can still win the round. Generally, I don't recommend going all in on disads counterplans against a K Aff. I think KVK or T or theory VK are generally more persuasive to most judges, but that's not to say that it is impossible, just to say that I have very rarely seen it work. And lastly, consider how your off-case positions interact, i.e. you probably should rethink a counterplan that uses the state if you read a state bad K. Like if you get up and read a cap K, you shouldn't get up and read like the United States federal government can solve this problem counterplan. Now you hypothetically can do that and just defend conditionality and like multiple options good, but you're going to have to be prepared for that debate because somebody will call you on the contradiction and make the argument that contradictions are a voting issue, and then you'll have to deal with that. So it's not necessarily that you can't read contradictory off-case positions, it's just that I would advise against it because it opens a whole can of worms that you really don't need to open. So that is my thoughts on picking off-case positions. If I could summarize what I think is the most effective, I would go for some kind of tier theory argument, and then from there, it's kind of a fork in the road. You can go K or you can go decide counterplan if it's a topical aff. I am partial to KVK debates. I think they're the most persuasive, and I think that they are the most they are the ones that are easiest to navigate the aff with tact because you're agreeing that the problem is legitimate and you're trying to solve it in a different way. And I think a lot of judges would share that sentiment. But if it's a topical aff, the decide counterplan route is totally good. But like I said, T in theory, always a good choice when addressing a K aff. So let's talk about line by lining the aff. Many of the arguments I talked about in the answering K's video, which is about answering the negative critique, still apply. In fact, some of these slides are going to be like almost exact copies of the answering K's stuff, but there's a couple of key distinctions that I want to make. So let's talk about line by lining the aff. So we'll go through each part of what a K aff includes, and we will talk about how to respond to them. So responding to the links of a K aff. So this is just things like link mitigation. The link is really small, or the link is so broad that it really doesn't matter. If everything links, then nothing links, right? On topical affs, you can make a link turn argument that the resolution actually worsens the situation, stuff like that. So this link debate is very familiar to link debates in any other part or subset of debate, but the implication is a little bit specific. So for a non-topical aff, if you prove that the links are false, i.e. for a non-topical aff, the links are saying the resolution is violent, so I can't defend it. So if you prove that those links are false, that supercharges a T argument because you're proving that there is a TVA, right? So answering the links proves that the aff is trying to solve for something that isn't a problem. Or better said, is avoiding implementing the resolution because the resolution is perceived to be part of the problem when in reality the resolution is not part of the problem. We're obviously not arguing that the problem described by a K aff is completely false, unless it's like a K Aff or something like that where you can get away with that. But for non-T affs, you're proving that the resolution is not an example of the violence that they're describing, and therefore topical versions of the aff exist that supercharges T, stuff like that. For topical affs, if the links are false, there's no post-fiat reasons to affirm, because the links are proving that the resolution does something positive in terms of addressing a form of violence. And so if you're proving that those links are false, that the resolution does not change anything for the better, then you're taking out the post-fiat level, and now you just have to engage on the pre-fiat level. Impacts. So note, when it comes to identity-based Ks, very, very, very little refutation happens on the impact level, because most impacts of identity Ks are undeniable moral truths, like racism is bad, sexism is bad, ableism is bad. All of these things are true. So instead, we go for arguments like, yes, those things are bad, but they are not the root cause of other forms of violence, meaning that we can focus on other forms of violence and solving those as well. Because if, say, ableism is the root cause of all forms of violence, then we have to address ableism first. But if I prove that ableism is not the root cause of all forms of violence, then my K that talks about a different form of violence other than ableism is now a very valid thing to pursue, because ableism is not the root cause. Now, for the structural Ks, so this is like K Affs that are about things like militarism, securitization, capitalism, biopower, stuff like that, that are not like necessarily tied to identity. We can occasionally get away with an impact turn, like saying capitalism is good, securitization is good, stuff like that, or impact mitigation, saying that like militarism is not actually that big of a deal, or securitization is not that big of a deal. But again, I'm going to say this one more time because I've seen it happen, so it seems obvious, but it's important to say we are not impact turning identity-based impacts. We are not impact turning identity-based impacts. So like I said, very little debate happens on the impact level, but the one that's always safe to go for is the no root cause argument. Now let's talk about the role of the ballot. If you went for a no root cause argument, the role of the ballot probably should not be the top priority for the judge anymore, because if ableism is not the root cause, why is ableism the only thing the ballot should focus on? So succeeding in the impact debate sets you up for success on the role of the ballot debate. But engaging with the role of the ballot proper, when coming up with reasons why the role of the ballot is bad, you can use theoretical arguments like, does the role of the ballot limit ground, or does it lead to strats skew, or does it force the neg to defend something that's morally reprehensible? You can also turn the role of the ballot as exclusionary. What kind of impacts does the role of the ballot ignore, and why is it a bad thing to ignore those impacts? And as always with framework debate, you should provide a counter framework, a counter role of the ballot. If you did not read a role of the ballot in the K, you can just make a counter role of the ballot on the line by line of the aff proper. But I always think that having a carded role of the ballot in something like a K is a little bit more persuasive. All right, advocacy. You cannot perm a K Aff. You cannot perm a K Aff. You cannot perm a K Aff. I've seen it happen before multiple times, and it just doesn't work. A perm, by definition, is a test of competition, and competition is a burden of the negative, meaning that definitionally, a perm is a type of argument that can never be made by the negative against the affirmative. If you're confused by that or any of the language I just used about test of competition and all that stuff, check out the video on perms. I explain why perms are exclusively an argument of the affirmative. And if you're still unclear, feel free to leave a comment or reach out or anything like that. Bottom line, you cannot perm a K Aff. But there are arguments you can make against the advocacy proper. Like, if the advocacy is unclear, don't vote on it. If you don't understand what the aff does, there's no reason for the judge to vote for it. Or vague advocacies are bad, because if we don't really know what the aff does, it can change what it is in later speeches, and that's theoretically unfair and uneducational, because we can't have proper clash. You can also argue that utopian or mindset fiats are bad. So if the K Aff tries to garner offense off of a mindset shift, you can argue that fiating that mindset shift is a bad thing, because it is basically makes the K Aff immune to criticism, which is bad for education, bad for fairness, etc., etc. It's a theory argument. But when it comes to the advocacy, most of the discussion that is going to be had is had on the solvency of the advocacy or the method of the critique. And so, just like with the negative critique, the kind of silver bullet argument you can make is that the advocacy somehow links to the K. And this is a little bit easier when it comes to topical K Affs, because if you can read a link turn that says the resolution actually makes the situation worse for the group that the K is trying to solve for, then you have in essence proved that the method of the AF is bad. And so that is offense, right? You can also make the argument that the advocacy doesn't solve. So you can make like using the state as essential, or university K arguments like reading the AF in an academic space dooms it to failure, stuff like that. And you can also garner offense, like making turn arguments against the solvency/method section by saying the method is uniquely bad. Like, does it enable state slapdowns, where it makes a movement visible to the state, which means it's easier for them to destroy it? Is the method inaccessible? If the method is not accessible to everybody that the AF is trying to solve for or employ in the solution, then it probably is going to be ineffective. Or is the method a ruse of solvency? Does it allow us to pat ourselves on the back and say we did it, racism is over, and then ignore the fact that it still very much exists and is just festering under the surface? So there are arguments that can be made on the solvency method level that are generating offense. So a quick note, that's kind of everything on line by lining that I wanted to get through, but I wanted to venture into the question of performance. So I mentioned in the Intro to K Aff videos about the nature of performance and what performative K Affs might look like. So a note on responding to performative K Affs: performances are often very personal to people, which means that we do not want to criticize the performance or the content of the performance itself. We want to criticize the efficacy of the performance as a strategy. And I know that might seem kind of vague, so I put examples here. So what we don't want to say is that the performance is poorly done, or the performance is lazy, or the performance is stupid. All of these are things I have heard in round before and things that we don't want to repeat. What we want to say instead is stuff like the performance does not have the desired effect, or the performance does not lead to the pre-fiat impacts that the AF argues, or the performance is not in line with the thesis of the K. So make sure that we are wording things not as like personal attacks against the performance, right? Because performances can be personal to people, and instead wording them as like, hey, we both care about this subject matter, but I don't think that this performance is going to be the most effective method for XYZ reason. It's not that the performance itself is bad, or that the person who did the performance is bad for doing it, right? And when you're answering a performance, it is always an option to do a counter performance to access the pre-fiat impacts of the AF. So if the AF reads a poem relating to the thesis of their K, the neg K could hypothetically read a poem relating to the thesis of the neg K. And then that makes the pre-fiat debate a little bit more of a wash, because either way you vote, you are endorsing the performative aspect of debate. So counter performance is always an option, but it is not a necessity. And there are instances in which I would say that counter performance is not desired, and that would be in like this identity group versus this identity group kind of debates. Which leads me into the strategic considerations. So I recommend that everybody that engages in circuit or progressive debate has a generic prep file that has K's and T theory arguments already written out against K Affs. The kind of staple things that I think every general prep file should have are a ballot K, a cap K, and a university K. And then from there you can get creative, like digging into some postmodernism and criticisms that exist there, and kind of getting into the weeds with individual methods and individual schools of K literature, like optimism against pessimism arguments or pessimism against optimism arguments, and stuff like that. But everybody that has the risk of debating against the K Aff should have this generic prep file made. And like I said at the top of the video, always ask yourself, are you addressing both the pre-fiat and post-fiat impacts? Because if you don't close both of those doors, you're leaving a path to the ballot open for the affirmative. And then this third point, as a rule of thumb, avoid this identity versus that identity debates. I kind of alluded to this at the end of the performance slide, But if the aff gets up and talks about a certain identity group, and the neg gets up and says, instead, we should talk about this identity group, that puts both the debaters and the judge in a relatively uncomfortable position of basically having to make the decision of which identity group deserves to be prioritized. So if you're going to, there are rare exceptions to that where there are like root cause claims at play that argue that addressing this identity helps everyone. But for the most part, unless there's a really good reason you want to avoid this identity versus that identity debates. um, Cross-X is really important against unique affs. Understanding comes first. If you don't understand the aff, you can't respond to it. So don't be afraid to use up a good chunk of prep time just asking, what does the aff do? And lastly, just like any framework in debate, if your opponent reads a framework, make sure that you impact some of your arguments to that framework. Impact things to the K Aff roll of the ballot whenever possible. That way, even if you lose the framing debate, you have a shot at winning the round. So I know that was a lot of information, a lot of ground to cover, but like I said, a lot of people will consider this to be the kind of peak of complexity when it comes to progressive debates, and I'm inclined to agree. So if you have any questions, leave a comment, reach out, anything like that, and hopefully this was helpful, and have a good rest of your day.